Archetti pulled his knife from his belt. The sharp blade glinted green from the streetlight. It was no longer red. Reese was breathing erratically, the air whistling through his nose. Archetti apologized to Reese for what he was about to do. If Reese hurt him, great. If not, cry about it later. The tip of the knife touched Reese's crusty lips. It was impossible to restrict the movement of Reese's head while holding the knife steady. For Archetti, he was playing football with 10 guys on the field and the plum-faced coach yelling, "Don, you're the quarterback and the wide receiver. Now go win the fucking game." Archetti, with surgical prudence, pushed the knife between Reese's lips. He could feel the warm blood leaking from the corners of Reese's mouth and onto his hands. "Fuck this. I knew I should have called for backup. What the hell were you thinking? Kablooey, kablooey!" A popping sound bounced around the cabin like a volcano had erupted. Archetti looked up and saw soupy pink and white viscera tendrils dripping from the cruiser's ceiling. One of the pustules on Reese's head had reached capacity and exploded. Archetti pulled the knife away from Reese's lips and covered his nose. The vile smell put a lump of vomit in his throat. Suddenly, blinding white light filled the cruiser. Archetti gaped out the back windshield. His heart panicked. A truck was speeding toward the cruiser, the lights getting closer and closer. The truck had to be going 60 miles per hour because before Archetti had time to jump back into his seat and buckle himself in, the truck smashed into the cruiser. Wham! The cruiser's back tires left the ground for a nanosecond as a jumbled symphony of breaking glass and metal banged inside Archetti's head. The cruiser spun around 180 degrees. The engine was smoking and sizzling like someone had tossed a bucket of water on a hot grill. Archetti, facing upside down in the crunched-up back seat, not 100% sure he was alive, listened powerlessly to the thunderous clopping of boots marching toward him. He heard masculine voices, but what they said was badly muffled. The violent clangor of the wreck continued to ring in Archetti's eardrums. The world sounded like he was 8 feet underwater. Archetti tried to move, but he was stuck, his legs pinned. The electronics in the cruiser were on the fritz, and the interior lights blinked in and out without rhyme or reason. You weren't the only one in the car. Why didn't the truck stop? What the fuck was that? You were not the only person in the car. Reese, Archetti said. Silence, was Reese's reply. Archetti heard the wail of an off-its-hinge door opening. The manly voices were on top of him. They were militant in tone. Clueless to their volitions, Archetti decided to play dead, self-preservation at the forefront of his mind. He closed his eyes and ebbed his breathing. He prayed to Jehovah that the men didn't hear him call out for Reese. Archetti pictured the faces of his wife and kids and promised himself there would be no coup de grace on his watch. As a father and a husband, there were rites of passage he needed to see through. Walking Ava down the aisle to give her away at her wedding, with tears in his eyes, to witness Marshall in his cap and gown at his high school graduation, proudly clapping and cheering for him because he secured a full ride to Princeton. And Candace, the love of his life. They'd be happy empty nesters, and in the newfound quiet of their home, they'd tumble to the bed and fall asleep in each other's arms, a 2-week vacation to Portugal waiting for them when they awoke. An immediate stabbing pain beamed an emergency text to Archetti's side. Attention needed right fucking now, it said. But he could hear someone foraging through the cabin. He had to eat the pain and accept the momentary punishment, which was the Bluebeard key to holding his wife and kids back again. Is he breathing? Yeah. I got a pulse. Is he awake? Negative. Concussion. Bad one. Roger that. Let's extract him and move out. Christ. What is it? The sores on his head. They all popped. Do I need to call it in? No. It's just the crash must have been unbearably painful. We don't get paid to have feelings for samples. Anything else fucked up on him? Lem examine him. The pain below Archetti's ribs made him flex his toes against the vamp of his police boots. He battled to keep his peepers shut and not move a limb. These men, whoever they were, needed to think Archetti was pushing up daisies. I feel this out-of-this-world pain before. The magnitude of the accident caused Archetti's adrenal system to put his body into a brief window of hibernation. Archetti's brain, major organs, and cortisol coordinated their signals to preserve his body's vitals. Once all the vital programs cleared the necessary checkpoints, Archetti's pain receptors flipped back on. Life found a way by taking a snooze. Damn, he's got a broken leg. Roger that. What part? Feels like the tibia. Compound? I don't see any protrusions. No blood. He's lucky he's light as a feather. Extraction team, you're clear to proceed. Archetti woke up in Harveston Regional Hospital. Franklin Hill had a building they called a hospital, but it was more like a glorified urgent care. Stitches and basic blood work were where they hit the ceiling in terms of actionable care. The first person Archetti saw was Candy. She was sitting in a brown recliner, her hand on her face, and looking down at her phone. I'm sorry, I hate to be a bird day, but it did feel so liberating to play and take it easy all day, but we've actually made so much progress. I know this moment was hard, but tired of Gary's sigh. I'll take the time off if you do it tomorrow. I can help with Dad. He held his hand out. She gripped it tight. He gazed at her gold wedding band and stared into her teary eyes. She smiled at him, and her chestnut-colored hair was luminous from the sunlight shining on her back. You look like an angel, Archetti said, wanting to shed a few tears of happiness, but couldn't because his lacrimal glands were dry as dusty wells. You're not dead, Candace said, and on a lot of painkillers. She let out a small laugh, and Archetti matched it. He asked where the kids were and got the report. Ava was staying at a friend's house, and Candace's mother, Terry, had driven up from Virginia to watch Marshall. Candace had been staying overnight, having breakfast and lunch at the hospital. She'd commute home around 5 p.m. to make dinner for the kids, eat what she could, and drive back to Harveston Regional to sit with her husband. How long? Archetti asked. 3 days, Candace said. Think of it as a long blackout, like you drank 2 handles of tequila, and for dessert, you decided to smoke a bag of weed. Similar to the adrenaline junkie days, Archetti's heavy drinking days were a thing of the past, too. He couldn't remember the last time he blacked out from too much of the drink. Archetti went to sit up, wanting to be closer to his wife's heart-shaped face. He grimaced in pain and looked at the clear tubes pumping drugs and saline into his body. It was the same pain. Archetti had playing dead in the cruiser, but fantastically numbed by the hydrocodone flowing through his blood. Candace squeezed his hand and motioned for him not to stress too much. A tranquil mind and body was the road back to full health. In the crash, your knife ended up in your side. You got tossed around really good, too. You lost a lot of blood, Dawn, Candace said. You needed a blood transfusion. A couple of them. Archetti nodded. The severity of how gravely wounded he was took a minute to land. His brain was slacking off. Everything was on 7-second delay. Candace didn't want to tell her husband how close he came to meeting his maker, but their relationship was founded on telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Candace also knew her husband would nag her until the sun went down and came up about the treatments he'd received. The irony of being in the hospital and having to rip the Band-Aid off wasn't lost on her. She would have snickered at the twisted, dark humor of it all, but Archetti was staring at her with his dark brown, crispy cream eyes, and the trepidation in them was palpable. "Reese, how's Reese?" Archetti asked, blinking his eyes rapidly, trying to get moisture into them. Candace cocked her head to the side. "Who's Reese?" she replied. "Archetti." Archetti took a profound breath. His side felt colossally inflamed, like the blade of the knife was still in there. His whole body had ranging degrees of soreness. Again, he winced in distress. "He was in the cruiser with me." "I swear on my Aunt Elsie's grave." "Dawn, there was nobody with you," Candace said. "You were the only one they pulled out." Aggravated, Archetti let go of his wife's hand and scratched his temple. Candace watched in real time as Archetti's heart rate blipped upward on the cardiac monitor's LED screen. "Dawn, you have to keep calm," she said in a gentle but commanding voice. "Oh, fuck all that," Archetti said. "I was driving into the station. He pissed outside the Starbucks, and the doctor said you probably suffered a concussion," Candace said. "When have I ever lied to you?" Candace shook her head and said, "Who would pee on a It wasn't on the actual Starbucks," Archetti said. "He peed on the sidewalk. And he looked so sick, and not in the noggin sick, like he had cancer. Something bad? I don't know. Whatever it was, it wasn't good. You gotta be sick in the head if you think it's perfectly normal to whip your thing out and start rinsing off the sidewalk," Candace said. Archetti's head sank into his pillow. He sighed. Candace folded her arms, filling her cheeks with air. This wasn't how she imagined her husband's re-entry into the cognizant realm going. It felt like she was walking on avian flu-contaminated eggshells, and the person who showed up from their slight coma was 70% of the person she married? How do I get that 30% of Dawn back? I know. The kids. That'll snap him out of this sicko who tinkled on the Starbucks obsession he's hung up on. What do you want to see the kids?" Candace asked. Archetti took his sweet time to answer. He was leagues deep in thought, baffled by who on the FHD would lie to his wife. There had to be proof of Reese's existence, that Archetti wasn't alone in the cruiser when some idiot with his head up his ass slammed into them like a bull on steroids. "Hold the fucking phone!" There was proof of Reese's existence. There was the cruiser's dash cam, and the camera on his vest was rolling when he approached Reese. Some knocks on the door cut off Archetti. He and Candace put on their best shit-eating grins. Archetti told the knocker to enter. The door moaned open and the doctor walked in. She was WNBA tall, thin, and wore Wayfarer-style eyeglasses. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail with streaks of bleach blonde in it. "I'm happy to see you awake and alert, Mr. Archetti," she said in a decorous and upbeat voice. "I'm Dr. Block. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a bus, doctor?" "That's almost an accurate assessment," Block said with a chuckle, shifting her gaze to Candace, detecting the strained vibe in the room. "Anywho, all your blood work came back excellent. If it weren't for the semi-truck that ran the red light, you'd be a picture of health." "It wasn't a semi-doc," Archetti said, "and the light was green." Candace looked at Dr. Block and gave her a crooked smile. Dr. Block's attention returned to Archetti and his testy mood. "We're going to run a few more cognitive tests. Make sure your brain is firing on all cylinders," she said. "You know what happens when I'm in Harveston?" Archetti asked. Candace interjected, directing her words to Block. "Don, he was on the FM killer case," she said. "He transferred to Franklin Hill to get away from the memories of it." "I see," Dr. Block said. Her patient had a history in Harveston, and it wasn't the kind of history that makes you think of rainbows and unicorns. "Were you ever diagnosed with PTSD?" Block asked Archetti. He hid his face in his hands, nearly pulling out the IV pick in his arm. Archetti wanted to weep. His worst nightmare had come true. He was back in Harveston, and like the notorious FM killer case, he had more questions than answers. Everyone around him, including Candace, felt aloof and foreign, as if the people in the room with him were phantoms in a Tim Burton movie. Maybe he had bled out in the cruiser, and the real Don Archetti was in a morgue in Franklin Hill with a tag tied around his big toe. Cause of death: helped man with a weak bladder, crushed to death by a semi-truck for no good reason. But it wasn't a fucking semi-truck. Archetti screamed. Candace and Dr. Block stared at him, their mouths agape. He took deep, windy breaths and said to anyone listening, "I want my phone and I want to call Chief Nash." What he said next flabbergasted Candace and made her contemplate the slim, supernatural possibility that her spouse had his body invaded by aliens before he was pulled out of the wreck. "And I want to be alone," Archetti said, insipid but stern. Reese's eyes popped open at the sound of some asshole pounding a fist against the plexiglass observation window. The man was about 10 feet from the chilly steel table Reese lay upon. The asshole was dressed in a bright yellow hazmat suit, and looking at the suit stung Reese's eyes. He went to move his arms but couldn't. Raising his head and tucking his chin into his neck, Reese saw his arms and legs were secured to the table, leather belts around them. He tried wriggling his wrists and ankles, but the scrapping leather felt like hot coals against his pasty skin. The leg he broke in the crash was in a soft cast and hurt like a paper cut. It was annoying and persistent, but not the apocalypse. "Hey!" Reese yelled at the man who was having a conniption. Reese thought he looked like a 6-foot child freaking out because his mother wouldn't let him get a pack of Sour Patch Kids at the movies. The man reversed, eyes wide, and scampered to a red button on the sterile white wall. The man hit the button. An alarm blared. The shrilling, banshee-like pitch sent shockwaves through Reese's ears, and a searing pain settled in the front of his skull. "Turn that fucking alarm off!" Reese yelled at the top of his lungs. Hysterical, he fought to free himself from the table as the man in the hazmat suit kept his eyes glued to the door. A group of men, also in hazmat suits, burst into the room. Reese continued to scream. It felt like a giant spider was trying to escape his body by chewing through his eye sockets. He leaned his head to the side. The hazmat men held stainless steel weapons resembling fire extinguishers, or goddamn flamethrowers. They hastily surrounded the table like a shiver of sharks to a wounded sea lion. They aimed the whirring mouths of their shiny weapons at Reese. "What the holy fuck is this?" Reese yelled, fustily kicking his good leg. The trilling alarm stopped and Reese could hear the men's breathing apparatuses. As a boy, he'd seen a movie where the main villain, a character shrouded in polished black and wearing a face mask made of metal, terrified him, breathed, like these men were. But Reese's childhood fear of Darth Vader was irrational in hindsight. Reese learned the true meaning of fear the day he signed his contract with Garwolf Bio and Farmtech. A man with broad shoulders approached the table, unclipped the hood of his hazmat suit, and placed it on the floor. His head was shaved bald, and his icy blue eyes were intimidating in a neo-Nazi sort of way. Sweat shined off his hairless skull, and the crow's feet around his deadly eyes ran deep. Reese figured the myriad of lines didn't come from watching Netflix comedies and yucking it up. The lines were immortal imprints, a running tally of how much pleasure he got from performing unthinkable torture on any human belonging to Garwolf's for sample program. Reese signed to be part of Garwoff's for sample program after his hoagie shop in Shamokin closed during the COVID pandemic and the government relief checks burned up faster than a buckwheat shrub in a California wildfire. Reese needed cash ASAP. Garwoff's terms were simple: 6 years of documented contributions to the program, and the associate walked away with a check for $250,000. Reese watched with anguish as the bills piled up on his kitchen table. He was also late on his rent 3 months in a row. The program at Garwoff wasn't the godsend Reese believed it to be. "Reese, it's nice to see you back home," the bald psycho said. "You know you weren't allowed to leave the research campus. It was in your contract." "Fuck you, Pilsner." Pilsner laughed. "Is that any way to talk to the person who saved your life? I thought you'd be a little more grateful." "I know what was in the contract," Reese said. "So you admit to being insubordinate," Pilsner said, "and being of sound mind when you deliberately broke your contract with Garwoff." Reese nodded. "I sure did, you fucking douchebag." Pilsner's gaze moved to a camera mounted in the corner of the room. He made sure Reese saw him point to it. Reese glimpsed it and stuck his tongue out. Since he couldn't flip it off, it was the only active chutzpah Reese had in his bag of tools. "We have your confession on video, Reese," Pilsner said with a snake-in-the-grass smirk. "You've never called me by my first name. Why now, Pilsner?" Pilsner gestured for his men to holster their weapons. They pushed the metallic hoses into a protracted rubbery sheath, which was clipped to the side of their utility belts. Through Reese's eyes, they were the devoted knights of an evil monarch who set their swords into their scabbards, awaiting the cue to decapitate the heretic. "I saw your tape," Pilsner said. If you lost your shit when he called you..." Don't say it," Reese shouted. "Tell me, who was your friend in the Bacon-mobile?" "A nice man," Reese said, as Pilsner bent over him and pulled a penlight from his back pocket. Reese could smell his breath. "Does Pilsner only eat tuna fish and garlic?" "Huh?" Pilsner shined the beam of white light directly into Reese's dilated eyes. The muscles in Reese's neck tightened as the thorny headache returned. He begged Pilsner to stop, imploring him with tears in his eyes, but Pilsner smiled heinously and dragged the penlight in methodical circles. "Reese, when you were back out there in the..." "If you're gonna kill me," Reese said, "kill me. I already have hundreds of time bombs that you dickheads put in me. But here's the good news. If you ever have some fancy dinner with the board, be sure to tell them their research center is built on Indian land, cursed Ojibwe land. And when any fuckhead working for a Garwoff leaves this earth, your soul belongs to them. They will have revenge." "They always do." Pilsner clicked off his penlight and stared into Reese's eyes. His eyes had no fear for the first time since joining Garwoff's program. Pilsner placed his hand on Reese's heart and stroked his cheek with his other hand. "You were a good egg, Reese Cameron. So many others would be dead by now. But there's nothing left for you." Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. He had a great fall. "Couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again," Pilsner said, snapping his fingers. He turned his back, grabbed his head cover, and walked to the door as the men armed themselves with their fire breathers. Reese stared at the ceiling. He saw a thick crack in it. The foundation is never as solid as they think it is. Too busy focus grouping the next Garwoff slogan, charging vacations to the company credit card, or boosting the stock with tricky math. Reese closed his eyes. Pilsner stopped at the door, raised his hand and snapped his fingers again. Click! Within seconds! The ultra-high-temp flames rinsed the skin off Reese Cameron's bones as Pilsner looked on from the other side of the plexiglass window. He pulled a wrinkled pack of Marlboros from his hazmat suit's breast pocket, along with a Wawa lighter. He popped a bent cancer stick into his mouth, lighting it up. Minutes later, a new team entered the room. The men and women were with Garwolf's sanitation department. They wore dark gray shirts and pants, and 95 masks. The Garwolf logo was screen printed on their shirts. An irascible Pilsner blew the smoke out his nostrils and shook his head. The shirt's logos used to be sewn on. Standards were being surrendered to the bazillions of overpaid bean counters in Plaza Building 31. Surprised, Pilsner heard Reese's ominous last words drifting around in his head. It was a stupid coincidence, he concluded. Garwolf Bio and Farmtech were simply trimming costs on shirts. It didn't mean the rug was being yanked out from under the company's big feet. Archetti pulled into the Wawa parking lot at 2:30 p.m. on a sunny, pillow-clouded day in September. It was the same Wawa he'd passed with Reese riding shotgun. The first Eagles game of the season played on his radio. They were beating the Chiefs 13-0 at halftime. He got out and walked around the rear of the store. When Archetti reached the back door, he took out his phone and texted. He could see the red Wawa sign peeking out from where he stood. He watched a blue heron roost itself on the sign. It was a magnificent bird with such an inquisitive way of craning its long-beaked head. Too many of us thinking we know. Archetti cradled his phone against his shoulder and reached into his pocket, removing a bottle of pills. The police shrink had him on Ativan 3 times a day to cope with the recurring nightmares he was having. His meetings with Chief Nash turned up zilch. According to the IT department, the footage from his cruiser and vest had been lost. They gave Archetti some runaround story about a North Korean hacker who briefly slipped into their network and stole sensitive information. The servers were shut down at the state's request until an update could be installed with an NSACETIV firewall to keep foreign actors' noses out of FHETEWs. Archetti thought the crab cakes were rotten in Baltimore. The door opened, and a woman in her late 30s with dyed red hair and tattoos on both arms, a colorful assortment of skulls and flowers, greeted Archetti. Her name tag read, Jenna Cabriano, store manager. Archetti eyed her hand. In it was a flash drive. I could get fired for this, Jenna said. So could I. I guess we're both the filling in a shit pie then, huh? Archetti smiled and nodded. That's the idea. He removed his wallet and extracted a roll of cash. Oh. They're trying to cover something up, Archetti said. I don't know what. Welcome to Franklin Hill, Jenna said, gazing at the olive-colored bills. I thought when I moved here I put the weird stuff in the past. Jenna held out the flash drive. Archetti took it and handed her the money. You're not going to count it? He asked. Oh man, you are new around here. You'd have to be a complete horse's ass not to pay me the amount we discussed. Making people laugh so. Have you ever wanted someone to take care of your problems, but find them too busy to take on a serious case? Yeah, I'm a little foggy. Oh, they put me on these pills. You selling? Archetti was ready to return to his car, listen to the Eagles game, and get home to his wife and kids. He and Candace had weathered the storm through all the ambiguous rubbish. He also told her more details from that night when he got home from the hospital, granular information that made it hard for Candace to believe that Archetti was fibbing. Archetti painted such a crystalline portrait of the man Reese was, not just some vagrant peeing out front of Starbucks. He was a real human being. He felt pain. He had a great-grandma with Indian blood. He'd given Archetti an abridged history lesson about the people who lived in Franklin Hill before the white world in Europe went to pot. No, Archetti said, I'm not that kind of cop. Hey! Did you watch the video from that night?" Jenna's mood turned frigid. It was a hot day, but Archetti felt the hairs on his arms peak and the goosebumps rise. Jenna took out a vape and hit it. The smoke that left her mouth smelled like menthol grapes. It reminded Archetti of a bubblegum he used to chew by the pack as a kid. Simpler times. "Where did they go? Will they come back?" "Probably not." "You got done dirty, dude," Jenna said. "And trust me, it won't be the last time." "Garde du Warfi." "Who?" "It was a garde du Warfi. They aren't called trucks, like military shit, but not a tank. The fuck they call them?" No. "Who is garde du Warfi?" Archetti said insistently. "Just the company that owns Franklin Hill," Jenna said. "They sell drugs. Legal ones. I think they make vaccines, too. My mom told me they used to do all these horrible experiments on animals. Then some 3-letter government agency showed up and put the kibosh on that." Archetti touched a scar on his side and grasped the flash drive tightly. He felt a panic attack coming, the sudden estrangement from the ground underfoot, the sweaty palms, his mouth going dry as cardboard. "You all right?" Jenna asked. "You don't look so hot." "I'll be fine, thanks," Archetti said. "I appreciate you doing this for me." "No worries," Jenna said. "Times are hard. Look at those gas prices, and I got 2 mouths to feed." "But the tax man can't see cash, right?" Archetti returned to his car and stared at the flash drive in his hand, setting it in the cup holder. He'd Google Gurwarf when he got home. Archetti powered his window down and leaned his head out. His eyes fell on the Wawa sign. He hoped the blue heron, a bird that had been a pterodactyl at some point in its transition, would still be there. Marshall loved dinosaurs, and Ava thought certain birds were pretty. Snapping a picture of a blue heron chilling on a Wawa sign with his iPhone didn't feel so anomalous as it should have. After Harveston and the mystery of Reese Cameron, it felt like 1 and 1 finally making 2 again. Archetti had a win-win on his hands. Oh boy. Skid sideways. He wasn't even a light breeze. Boom! Across the street, a telephone pole culpably over and splintered when it hit the concrete. Bad, long pieces of serrated wood caused cars, trucks, and SUVs to skid sideways, their brakes screaming for mercy. The crunching of Chinese-made bumpers colliding was everywhere. Inside Archetti's car, the steering wheel shook in his hands, and the loose change in the cup holders clattered about like a heavy metal concert. Archetti watched in helpless horror as people sprinted into the Wawa for safety. He saw racks stocked to the brim with chips and pretzels spilled to the floor. Franklin Hill was having an earthquake, a formidable one. Archetti pulled out his iPhone and FaceTimed Candace. She answered. Archetti's screen was like watching a found footage horror movie while riding a wooden roller coaster, but keeping himself in frame was enough to make anyone vomit. The connection was spotty with pixelated squares and offensive lines of RGB-colored interference corrupting the screen. He told Candace he loved her and told her to tell the kids he loved them. Then the world went still. The earthquake was over. Archetti could hear the wail of sirens singing all around him. He clicked off the FaceTime with Candace and stared at the flash drive in the cup holder. Archetti hugged his wife and kids when he stepped through the front door. He kissed Candace on the lips in a way that he would know her taste forever. In the kitchen, Archetti grabbed 2 bottles of Yingling. Both were for him. On his way out of the kitchen, he took the bottle of Ativan from his pocket and put it inside the microwave. Candace didn't say anything and was relieved he didn't hit the power button. Archetti trudged into the living room, sat in his favorite chair, and turned on the TV. He wanted to watch the end of the Eagles game, but the local news was covering the devastating aftermath of the earthquake. The news chopper zoomed in on the Starbucks on N Center Street. A broad and deep chasm had opened below the sign, and fissures, like thin sprigs, devastated the sidewalk and the street. Archetti, taking a sip of his beer, instantly recognized the spot where the most expansive crater was. It was where Reese Cameron, on that demure and fetching night in June, had pissed on the sidewalk.